My daughter-in-law mentioned their 5-day Maldives trip and business class flights were already paid for. An hour later, my emergency account showed a balance of negative $44,000. I sat alone in my kitchen, holding the old teacup my husband had given me, wondering when my love for them became their license to take. I thought it was just about the money, but what I discovered next changed everything. I began my morning the same way I always did. 2 scoops of ground coffee, 1 slow pour of water, and the kettle set to precisely 198 degrees. Old habits die hard after 30 years working in federal aviation. The discipline, the timing, the quiet in between, it sticks to you like the scent of jet fuel. I hadn't been in a cockpit for over a decade, but my mornings still moved with the rhythm of takeoffs and landings. My apartment overlooked the edge of Sedak Airport. From the kitchen window, I could watch the jets lining up, slicing through the gray Pacific skies. There was comfort in their predictability. They never asked for more than they needed, never crossed the lines that kept them safe. I used to think people worked the same way. I had no plans that morning, just emails to check for the women's safety group I co-ran, and maybe a walk if the rain held off. Then I opened Instagram. Vanessa had posted again. A flat lay of a room service breakfast. Golden croissants, sliced papaya, captioned with a thank you to the woman who inspired her daily. She wrote my name. It should have felt like love. For a moment, maybe it did. But the picture felt staged, as if meant for someone else's admiration, not my own feeling. Still, I let it pass. Perhaps that's what mothers do. Let things pass, even when they feel wrong. I left my phone on the counter and opened the pantry. Then I heard it. A voice from the living room. Vanessa's voice, on speakerphone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the apartment was small. "Hi," unfiltered, she said. "The Maldives resort and business class flights are all paid. We're leaving in 4 days." She laughed. I mean, with her history in aviation, she wouldn't mind. She's used to people flying away. It was a joke. I knew that. But it didn't feel like one. Not after everything. That's when I felt it, a quiet, pressing knot in my chest. I walked back to the kitchen, took a sip of my now cold coffee, and stared at the phone she had left charging. My name sat beneath her last post, all caps, all praise. That was the moment something shifted. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I could feel it rising, like the moment right before a plane leaves the ground. You can't go back, only forward. If you've ever had a moment where someone used your kindness as currency, you'll understand what came next. I didn't confront her, not immediately. Instead, I cleaned the already clean stovetop, straightened the spice jars, and reset the kettle. Then I opened my laptop. Not for emails, not for the safety curriculum I was editing. I opened it for the bank. I logged into the secondary account, the one for emergencies. The screen loaded slowly, or maybe it was my own breathing that had stalled. Balance: $44,132. Red numbers. No explanation, no alert. Just gone. I froze, not from shock, but from something colder, a system shutting down. I clicked through the transactions. The most recent was a booking through a high-end travel agency. An all-inclusive resort in the Maldives. A private villa, 5 nights, plus business class airfare. Booked under Joel's name, paid for using my routing number. The room spun slightly, not with rage, but with clarity. They had access. That was the first truth I had to accept. Joel had helped me set up that account years ago after Robert passed. I hadn't thought twice when he suggested linking it to his name in case I ever needed help. Back then, the gesture felt like love. Now, it felt like a trap I had built with my own hands. I closed the laptop. I wasn't sure what disturbed me more, the money itself, or the fact that I couldn't remember the last time Joel had looked me in the eye without blinking. In the living room, Vanessa was still on the phone, laughing about setting the tone for the brand. I stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cold. Planes lined the sky. Out there, my thoughts slowed. I didn't cry. I felt hollow. They didn't ask. They just took. And worse, they wrapped it in words like gratitude, in captions and curated smiles. They framed it as a gift I had given willingly. I leaned on the railing. There had been signs I'd brushed off. Joel avoiding talk about work, Vanessa insisting on tagging me in photos I wasn't even in. I mistook it all for awkward affection. This wasn't a mistake. This was calculation. I turned back inside. Vanessa was off the phone. She smiled as if nothing had happened and asked if I wanted tea. I nodded. I sat at the table and picked up the teacup, one from a set Robert and I had bought on our 25th anniversary. Bone china, a hairline crack at the base. I ran my thumb along the rim. This wasn't just about a trip. This was about permission they never asked for. Now that I had seen it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. Whatever came next would not be gentle, but it would be necessary. I waited until the apartment was empty. Vanessa had a shoot for her wellness podcast. Joel tagged along. The silence that followed was different. Not peaceful, but sharp, surgical. I opened the drawer under the bookshelf and pulled out the small fireproof box I hadn't touched in years. Inside, everything sat where I'd left it. The old USB Joel had configured, the routing documents, the backup login, and a file folder with Robert's initials. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for a record. That account was the result of years of structured saving. It was meant to be invisible for the worst-case scenario. And now, it had been drained. I powered up the old laptop Joel swore I should retire. I logged into the private folder. Joel's name was right there as secondary signer. I clicked into the activity log. The transaction for the Maldives trip hadn't been done through the usual interface. It was pushed through using an internal authorization method that bypassed standard alerts. It wasn't a method a normal user could access, but someone who worked in systems integration, or someone who had watched closely while I worked late nights for the FAA, could have learned it. I didn't shake. Something in my spine locked into place. I was no longer guessing. I knew he hadn't just borrowed. He had manipulated the very system he once helped me build. I opened a spiral-bound notebook and wrote down every transaction, every date, every confirmation code. Then I wrote the name of the travel agency. Beneath it, a single sentence. He knew exactly what he was doing. Edunai. I returned everything to the box. I made tea, the same way I always did. Then I sat with the mug cupped in my hands and breathed. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the shift, the moment someone you love stops being someone you trust. And just like that, I knew the rest of the story hadn't even begun. 3 days later, they left for the Maldives. Vanessa wheeled out 2 matching aluminum suitcases, wearing a linen jumpsuit. Joel carried the camera bag and passport folder. He barely made eye contact when he hugged me goodbye. I stood in the doorway and watched their rideshare pull away, wondering if either had considered leaving a note. Once they were gone, I walked straight to the second bedroom, the one they called an office. I opened the closet and pushed aside spare blankets. Behind them sat a black fireproof briefcase. Inside was the original folder Joel and I had created when he insisted on helping streamline my finances. One tabbed envelope stood out, printed with my full name. Inside was a copy of a financial access agreement I didn't remember signing. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, but it was scanned, not original. I knew because the tail of the E in Norwood curved inward, a quirk I hadn't had in years. I set it aside. Next, I opened my email. There was one person I trusted, Monica. She used to be a junior manager under me, before shifting to compliance for a private aviation firm. We hadn't spoken in a while, but she was always precise, discreet, and direct. I wrote a short, emotionless message, asking if she had time for coffee to discuss a potential breach of digital authorization protocols. She would understand. Within the hour, she replied, Saturday morning, cafe on South Hill. Ekunukran. I exhaled slowly. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the old FAA compliance portal I still had access to as a retired consultant. The framework Joel used was eerily similar to a vulnerability we'd patched in 2008. I remembered him sitting beside me in the office as I wrote the recommendation memo. He was still in school then, just curious. Now he had weaponized the very thing I taught him to protect. I logged out. The clock read 4:13 p.m. I made tea and pulled out a legal pad. I wrote a list: items to print, items to verify, a timeline, names, dates. At the top of the page, I added 2 words: document everything. There was no panic, no rage, only motion. And this time, it belonged entirely to me. Monica arrived 5 minutes early. I slid into the seat across from her and placed the envelope on the table. She opened it, scanned each page, then put on her glasses and read the digital signature date a 3rd time. Her first words were quiet. This was deliberate. She tapped the top corner of the authorization form. A sequence code showed it had been submitted remotely, not signed in person, and verified through a system Joel often used at his firm. He knew what would go undetected. Monica flipped to the transfer logs. The timestamps were between 2:00 and 4:00 a.m., spaced over 3 weeks. He hadn't taken it all at once. He had chipped away at it slowly. I watched Monica's mouth tighten. When she finished, she closed the folder. What do you want to do next? I told her I wasn't interested in suing, not yet. I needed everything documented first. If there was a confrontation, I wanted it to stand on facts, not emotion. Monica nodded once. She pulled out a legal pad and began sketching a chain of custody map. We worked in silence for an hour, cross-referencing bank logs with Vanessa's timestamp posts, matching travel dates with Joel's authorization codes. At one point, Monica asked if I had kept the original laptop Joel configured for me. I had. She smiled, saying it could help establish the window of the first breach. When we finished, she left me with a new instruction sheet, backup protocol, a secure messaging app, and recommendations for a lawyer specializing in elder financial manipulation. It felt strange to be a case study, but it also felt like being seen. I left the cafe as the clouds started to gather. That night, I sat in silence, reading each file again. Sometime around midnight, I wrote a single sentence at the bottom of my legal pad. Kay learned all of this from me. Now I will teach him something else. Where's Stewie? They returned from the Maldives late on a Wednesday. I heard their key in the lock just after 9. Their voices were light. I stayed in my room, lights off, observing. They unpacked in the living room. Vanessa talked about the humidity, the mango sorbet. Joel mumbled about time zones. Then came the part I had anticipated. Vanessa asked if I had checked the mail. Joel reminded her to transfer the final balance for a photo shoot. She laughed and said she'd use the shared card. I wrote the time in my notebook, 9:41 p.m. The next morning, I rose before them, made coffee, then walked to the copy center and printed 3 folders. One for my records, one for Monica, and one sealed in a manila envelope for Joel. I left it on his desk. No note. By noon, he hadn't touched it. By 5, it was still there. But at 7:28 p.m., the apartment got quiet. He didn't knock. He just stood in the hallway. When I finally walked past him, he looked up. His face was pale, drawn, almost small. I poured a glass of water and said I'd be transferring the lease. Soon. He would need to start planning. Still no words. So I kept going. I told him I had spoken to legal counsel, that there were digital logs and signature discrepancies showing unauthorized access. That I had not filed formal charges yet, but I would if anything else disappeared. Then I turned and looked directly at him. I said his name once, calm and steady. It didn't matter whether he apologized. The damage wasn't just done, it was documented. I walked back to my room and closed the door gently. That night, Vanessa didn't post anything. And for the first time in months, the apartment felt still. Not peaceful, not yet, but honest. And sometimes, that's where repair has to begin. The next few days passed with an odd rhythm. Joel stayed quiet. I noticed the shift right away. He stopped correcting Vanessa's captions. He sat longer in silence. Vanessa tried to carry on, but it felt forced. The comments on her posts dropped off. 1 or 2 followers, hinted that something was off. One afternoon, I heard her raise her voice behind their door. She was asking Joel why a payment hadn't cleared. He mumbled something. She grew sharper. Then came the kind of silence that settles into walls. I stayed in my room, not to hide, but to let it all land. That evening, I made a call and reserved the small apartment by the lake. I set the move-in date for the 1st of the month. When I returned, Joel was at the table, the same folder open before him. He didn't look up. He just asked if I hated him. I said nothing. I walked past him and returned to my room. Later that night, I heard drawers opening, packing. The next morning, a note sat on the counter. Joel had gone to stay at a friend's. Vanessa didn't mention it. She continued filming, but I noticed her posting less. And me? I began sorting through boxes I had put off for years. Each object had weight, but none of it felt heavy anymore. I wasn't just leaving, I was choosing what not to carry forward. That felt more powerful than anything I could say out loud. 2 days before my move-out date, Vanessa knocked on my bedroom door. Her voice was soft. I opened the door. She stood there in a pale robe, barefoot, her face less polished, as if she'd run out of filters. She stepped into the room. She said she knew about the folder. Joel had told her everything. Not everything, but enough. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. She said she didn't know the details, but she admitted she'd noticed how money just flowed. She'd let herself believe I had simply offered support without boundaries. I listened, and for the first time I believed she wasn't acting. Then she told me something unexpected. They'd pitched a brand partnership using the Maldives trip. It had been approved with a hefty advance. The entire vacation had been content creation, and the payment had just been sent to their joint account. She said it as if it were a gift. I looked at her and said I didn't want the money. Not a cent. She blinked, as if I'd spoken another language. Then she asked if I would reconsider staying. That's when I finally stood. I told her gently this wasn't about reimbursement or forgiveness. It was about peace, and I was reclaiming mine. She left without arguing. That night, I boxed up the last of my things. I labeled each box with care. Then I sat in the empty room and listened to the sound of nothing. In the morning, I left a small envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside, I placed the key and a note with only one line. No passwords, no access, no return. Then I closed the door behind me, locked it one last time, and walked away with both hands empty, my head held still. It didn't feel triumphant, but it felt honest. The lake apartment welcomed me, with the soft hum of stillness. I unpacked slowly. After months tangled in someone else's current, that alone felt like freedom. On Sunday evening, Monica visited. She brought warm cornbread and a bottle of elderberry syrup. She handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a full report. Every transaction, every flagged signature, a timeline of breaches. At the bottom was a note, prepared for legal submission, pending your direction. I placed it in a drawer, not as a threat, but as a safeguard. Monica hesitated before leaving. She said the report had one unexpected detail. Joel had quietly attempted to reverse 2 of the transfers last week. He didn't succeed. The system blocked him. But the attempt had been logged. That information landed heavier than I expected. Joel was unraveling, not loudly, but in the quiet, shameful way that happens when consequences arrive with no audience. After Monica left, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what was lost. Not just the money or trust, but the version of motherhood I had clung to for too long. The one where love meant endless forgiveness, where my lack of boundaries was mistaken for strength. That night I wrote a letter. Not to send, but to write. I told Joel I loved the boy he used to be, but I didn't know the man he had become. I signed it with my full name. Not Mom, just me. Then I folded it and placed it in the drawer. There was nothing vengeful in my heart, only clarity. 3 weeks passed without a single message. Then, on a gray Tuesday, a letter arrived. Plain envelope, just my name in Joel's familiar hand. I sat with it for several minutes before opening it. The letter was brief. He wrote that he didn't know how to make up for what he did. He admitted to forging my name, moving the money, and justifying it until it no longer felt like theft. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He just wanted me to know he finally understood why I walked away. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer next to my own. 2 stories, both true, both incomplete. Later that evening, Monica called. She had spoken with her contact at Joel's old firm. Joel had stepped away from several freelance accounts. No drama, just slowly untangling himself. Monica said something that stayed with me. Some people learn from loss only when there's nothing left to explain it away. That night, I didn't feel proud or vindicated. I felt quiet. And in that quiet, I finally saw what this had all become. Not a fall from grace, but a shedding. The roles I had clung to had cracked under pressure. What remained wasn't weakness. It was something clearer. 2 days later, I packed a small tote and drove north to a short coastal stretch where the trees opened to sea cliffs. I spent my mornings watching seabirds dive into gray-blue water. For the first time in years, I felt no tension in my chest, no need to explain myself. I was simply where I was, whole, weathered, and still here. And that felt like the beginning of something. It was late autumn when I returned to the lake apartment. The folder was still in the drawer. So was my letter and Joel's. I didn't need to reread them. That chapter was closed. Instead, I opened the window. I wrapped myself in a blanket and watched the water ripple. It was a quiet kind of contentment. The next morning, I walked to the co-op grocery store. The cashier handed me a flyer for a local skills-sharing group for seniors. Budgeting, tech literacy, navigating insurance. I tucked it into my pocket. That night, I called the number. 2 weeks later, I was at a round table with 5 other women and a quiet man named Will. They spoke openly about their frustrations. I didn't tell them everything, but I told them enough. I talked about what it meant to love someone who crossed a line, about setting boundaries too late, about learning to say no. No one interrupted. When I finished, one woman nodded. "You kept your dignity," she said softly. "That's no small thing." After the session, Will offered to carry a box of forms to my car. As we walked, he asked if I was planning to come back. I said I was, and I meant it. That night, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My hair had silvered more this past year. My eyes looked clearer. I didn't see a woman who had lost something. I saw a woman who had finally stopped giving herself away. And in that quiet truth, I turned off the light and went to bed. The winter that followed was the quietest season I had known in years. I didn't hear from Joel again. It wasn't about cutting him off. It was about no longer anchoring my peace to his learning curve. The group at the library invited me to speak at a public meeting about financial boundaries. I prepared my notes, but when I stood at the podium, I let the pages fall. I spoke from memory, about trust, self-worth, and how generosity, when unguarded, can become permission for others to take what was never theirs. When I finished, a woman in the second row whispered, "Thank you." That was enough. That night, I walked home under a sky full of stars. No noise, no weight, only the soft sound of snow under my boots and the quiet certainty that I had come through something. Not broken, not bitter, just awake. The apartment glowed warm when I returned. I made tea, curled up by the window, and looked out across the lake where the water had begun to thaw. Not spring yet, but close. And that, I thought, is enough for now. If this story spoke to something quiet in your heart, you're not alone. If you've ever had to walk away to find peace, I hope this story reminded you that dignity is about remembering your worth. Thank you for listening, and take gentle care of yourself.